Ken isn't lazy. He's tired. That tiredness shows up every morning when he promises himself he'll eat better tonight, stop scrolling earlier, start again tomorrow. By evening, the old pattern quietly takes over. Food, screens, delay. You may recognize this rhythm. Have you noticed how change fails not because you don't care, but because you try to change everything at once? This story isn't about motivation or discipline speeches. It's about a simple Japanese system that works quietly, almost invisibly, and why it succeeds where loud gurus collapse. It begins with an ordinary man, an ordinary relapse, and a different way forward. Ken is 34. He works an administrative job, sits too long, commutes too far, and tells himself he'll fix it when life slows down. It never does. If this sounds familiar, it's because many lives look like this from the inside. You want change, you just don't want another failure. Most advice tells you to push harder, wake earlier, cut everything out, become someone new overnight. This approach feels powerful for a week, then disappears. What if the problem isn't your willpower? What if the problem is the size of the promise you keep making? There is a Japanese philosophy that approaches change differently. It doesn't ask for intensity, it asks for consistency. It doesn't demand transformation. It builds identity quietly, through actions so small they barely register. Used in Japan for centuries, this system was designed for ordinary people living ordinary lives. If you're expecting hype, this will disappoint you. If you're expecting punishment, it won't come. This method works in silence, without announcements, without streaks, without self-hatred. And that's exactly why it lasts. Before we go any further, consider this gently. You don't need to believe yet. You only need to stay with this story long enough to see how quiet change actually begins and why it feels different when it finally stays. For ordinary people living ordinary days like yours, right now, today, still. Before the story continues, take a small step with us. Subscribe to this channel, tap like, and leave a comment below. In that comment, name one small habit you are willing to make visible today. Not a goal, not a promise to change your life. Just one tiny action you can stand behind publicly. Something simple enough to do even on a tired day. This comment is not for accountability pressure. It is a quiet declaration. Write it once, and then let the story continue. No explanations needed, just honesty, and the willingness to begin smaller than feels comfortable today, quietly. Ken is 34 years old, and nothing in his life looks broken from the outside. He works as an office administrator, the kind of job that keeps things running quietly while no one notices. His commute is long enough to drain him before he reaches home. His days are filled with emails, forms, small problems that never fully resolve. By the time he clocks out, he feels used up, not dramatic, just empty. At home, evenings slide into each other. Dinner is fast and forgettable. A screen fills the quiet while time disappears. Ken tells himself he deserves rest, and he does. But rest turns into avoidance. You may know this feeling. The day ends, and you're not sure where it went, only that you're too tired to change anything now. Ken's short temper arrives at night. Not explosive, just sharp enough to hurt. He answers questions too quickly. He sighs more than he listens. He notices it, and the guilt comes later, usually when the house is quiet and his phone is still glowing in his hand. His emotional anchor is his daughter, Hana. She is 8 years old and observant in a way children are. She notices patterns adults pretend aren't there. She asks why he's always tired. She asks why he doesn't play like he used to. Ken smiles and says soon. soon becomes a word he uses often and believes less each time. In the mornings, Ken wakes with good intentions. He thinks about eating better, moving more, being present. He tells himself today will be different. These thoughts feel sincere. By noon, work takes over. By evening, his energy is gone. The gap between intention and action widens, quietly, without drama. This is where many lives stall, not at failure, but at repetition. The same day, again and again, until it feels permanent. Ken doesn't feel hopeless. He feels stuck. Stuck is harder because it doesn't demand attention. It just waits. You might recognize this stage. Nothing is falling apart, but nothing is moving forward either. The body adapts to stillness. The mind adapts to delay. Over time, even the desire to change softens, because wanting without acting hurts too much. Ken tells himself he'll fix things when work slows down, when Hana is older, when he has more energy. These conditions never arrive. Life doesn't pause to make room for transformation. It keeps going, asking you to change inside it, not after it. Late one night, Ken watches Hana sleeping. He notices how quickly she's growing. He feels a quiet fear he doesn't name. Not panic. Just the sense that time is passing whether he changes or not. This moment doesn't inspire action yet. It only plants discomfort. The story settles here, in this ordinary life that won't move. No big crisis, no collapse. Just a man, tired, caring, and unsure how to begin again without failing one more time. And somewhere inside this stillness, something small is beginning to loosen, waiting for the smallest possible crack to appear. The day of the school sports event arrives without importance in Ken's mind. He almost forgets it until Hana reminds him over breakfast, her voice light, already dressed in her sports uniform. She asks if he'll run with her during the parent activity. Ken hesitates for a fraction of a second, then says yes. Of course he does. Saying yes feels easier than explaining why he might not. You may recognize this moment. The promise is made not from confidence, but from hope. Hope that somehow, when the time comes, your body will cooperate. Hope that effort will appear when it's needed. The school field is bright and noisy. Parents stand in loose groups, some stretching, some laughing. Ken feels slightly out of place. He hasn't run in years, not really. Still, when Hana reaches for his hand, he grips it and smiles. She looks proud. That alone feels worth it. The whistle blows. They start jogging. For the first few seconds, Ken keeps pace. Hana laughs, pulling him forward. Then his breath tightens. His chest feels heavy. His legs resist. He slows without meaning to. The noise around him fades as his focus narrows to his breathing. Halfway across the field, he stops. It isn't dramatic. He doesn't fall. He just can't continue. He bends forward, hands on his knees, trying to inhale without panic. Hana takes a few more steps before noticing. She turns around, confused. She doesn't understand what's happening yet. She just waits. That look stays with him. Not disappointment. Confusion. A teacher gestures gently, offering help. Other parents keep moving. No one laughs, no one points. And yet Ken feels exposed in a way that's hard to explain. This failure is small, quiet, and deeply personal. It happens in front of the one person he wants to impress without trying. Ken waves Hana on. She hesitates, then runs to finish with another parent. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't need to. The space between them fills with something unspoken. Later, in the car, Hana talks about her friends, her race, the snacks. Ken listens, nodding, answering where needed. The moment is already slipping into the background for her. For him, it's settling deeper. That night, when the house is quiet, the feeling returns. Not anger, not shame in the loud sense, something heavier. He thinks about how easily he said yes, how certain he sounded. He thinks about the promises he's made before, and how often they dissolve at the moment of effort. This is where motivation usually steps in, the harsh voice that says never again, the plan to overhaul everything. Ken feels that impulse rise, then stall. He's too tired to build another system that will collapse in a week. He's tired of failing in ways that hurt quietly. You may know this moment too. When motivation dies, not because you don't care, but because caring hasn't been enough. The usual tools no longer work. The slogans feel empty. The pressure feels pointless. Ken doesn't tell anyone about the moment on the field. There's nothing to explain. No one asks. That makes it worse, in a way. The failure belongs entirely to him. He goes to bed earlier than usual. Sleep comes slowly. His mind keeps replaying the look on Hana's face, the way she waited without understanding. He realizes this isn't about running. It's about trust, about the quiet agreements children make with their parents, expecting them to hold. This moment doesn't break Ken. It softens something. It strips away the idea that effort alone will save him. It leaves him open, uncertain, and unusually willing to listen to something different. When motivation disappears, something else has room to enter. Not force, and not urgency, just openness. And in that openness, the possibility of change finally finds a place to land. A week passes after the school event. Nothing dramatic changes. Ken goes to work, comes home, eats dinner, scrolls, sleeps. But something lingers. The memory doesn't fade the way others do. It stays present, not accusing, just quietly there. You may know this feeling when an experience doesn't shout, but it also doesn't leave. Ken schedules a routine checkup at a local clinic. He tells himself it's practical. Blood pressure, weight, basic things. He doesn't expect anything meaningful to come from it. Still, he shows up tired, slightly guarded, unsure what he even wants to say. That's where he meets Dr. Mori. Dr. Mori is not what Ken expects. He's soft-spoken, unhurried, and listens more than he talks. There's no clipboard lecture, or no warning about consequences. When Ken mentions feeling tired all the time, Dr. Mori nods as if this is a familiar story. "You're not broken," he says gently. "You're overloaded." Ken exhales without realizing he was holding his breath. Instead of asking about goals, Dr. Mori asks about days, what mornings feel like, what evenings look like, where energy disappears. Ken answers honestly, surprised by how easy it feels to speak without being corrected. Dr. Mori introduces a Japanese philosophy without ceremony. He calls it Kaizen, small continuous improvement, used in Japan for centuries, not just in factories, but in daily life. He explains it not as a rule, but as a lens. In the West, he says, we try to change outcomes. Kaizen changes processes. Ken doesn't fully understand, but he listens. Dr. Mori explains the habit loop in simple terms: cue, action, reward. He mentions how willpower fades through the day, how the brain protects energy by resisting big changes. He references modern research briefly, the kind studied at places like MIT, but doesn't linger. The science feels supportive, not heavy. Your problem isn't discipline, Dr. Mori says. It's scale. Ken waits for the hard part. The plan, the demand, it doesn't come. Instead, Dr. Mori asks him to choose one action so small it feels almost meaningless. Something he could do even on his worst day. No tracking, no streaks, no punishment if he forgets. Ken feels skeptical. Part of him wants something harder, something that proves seriousness. Another part feels relieved. Dr. Mori notices the hesitation. He smiles slightly. Big changes fail loudly, he says, where small ones succeed quietly. Ken leaves the clinic with no grand plan, no diet, no schedule, just a single suggestion written on a small card. It feels almost insulting in its simplicity. 5 minutes. That's it. As he sits in his car, Ken stares at the card longer than he expects. He thinks about all the plans he's tried before, all the effort that burned out. This feels different, not because it's inspiring, but because it asks so little. You may feel this moment too. The discomfort of simplicity, the doubt that something gentle could work where force did not. Ken doesn't decide anything yet. He just doesn't throw the card away. He puts it in his pocket and drives home, carrying something new. Not motivation, not certainty, just curiosity. And sometimes, curiosity is enough to begin. The card stays in Ken's pocket for 2 days. He feels it when he sits, a small reminder he doesn't yet act on. On the third evening, after dinner, he notices the familiar pull toward the couch. The screen waits. The day has already taken enough. This is usually where intention ends. He remembers Dr. Mori's words, not as a command, as an option. 5 minutes. Ken stands up without announcing it. No music, no gear. He puts on his shoes and opens the door. The night air is cooler than he expects. He steps outside, feeling faintly ridiculous. You may know this feeling, when an action feels too small to matter and too visible to ignore. He walks to the end of the street and back. That's it. No sweat, no rush. 5 minutes pass quickly. When he returns home, nothing dramatic has changed. His body feels the same. His mind feels the same. The screen is still there. But something else is different. He did what he said he would do. That night, Ken doesn't feel proud. He feels neutral, and that surprises him. There's no rush, no reward spike, just a quiet sense of completion. He sleeps slightly easier, though he doesn't connect it yet. Day 2 arrives. The thought of the walk returns after dinner. This time it's less awkward, still not exciting, still small. He walks the same route, 5 minutes again. He notices a neighbor's light turning on, a dog barking, ordinary life continuing around him. You might expect motivation to grow here. It doesn't. What grows instead is familiarity. The action becomes less about effort and more about sequence. Dinner ends, shoes on, door opens. No debate. On day 3, Hana notices. She watches him lace his shoes and asks where he's going. Just a short walk, he says, and he doesn't invite her yet. He wants to protect the simplicity. She nods and goes back to her drawing. Ken walks alone. His pace is slow. His thoughts drift. He notices how little resistance there is now that the decision is smaller than his excuses. This is the Japanese method at work, reducing friction until action becomes easier than avoidance. Dr. Mori explained that identity doesn't begin with results. It begins with repetition. The brain learns who you are by what you do, not what you plan. Ken doesn't think of himself as someone who exercises, but he does think, for a moment, I'm someone who walks after dinner. That thought feels fragile. He doesn't hold on to it. He doesn't need to. The system doesn't require belief, only return. These first days aren't inspiring. No one congratulates him. There's nothing to post. That's the point. The Japanese philosophy treats change like planting, not performing. You don't pull on the seed to make it grow faster. Ken misses one night in his head, imagining the future. He wonders if 5 minutes can really lead anywhere. The old voice whispers that this is pointless, that he should do more or stop pretending. He lets the thought pass. On the third night, after the walk, he sits with Hana while she colors. He's more present, though he doesn't know why. He listens longer. He reacts slower. These shifts are subtle enough to miss if you're not paying attention. You may be tempted to rush this stage, to add more, to optimize. The system asks you not to. Early change is delicate. It survives by staying small. Ken places his shoes by the door before bed. Not as a rule, as a suggestion to tomorrow. He doesn't feel transformed. He feels slightly steadier. That's new. 5 minutes didn't change his body yet. It changed his relationship with starting. And that difference, though quiet, is enough to make him wonder what might happen if he keeps going. Just a little longer, without demanding proof too soon. By the end of the first week, the walks no longer feel like a decision. They feel like a pause. Dinner ends, the plates are cleared, and Ken's body begins moving before his thoughts argue. You may recognize this shift, when effort quietly gives way to rhythm. Ken still walks only 5 minutes. He hasn't added distance. He hasn't increased speed. The Japanese principle doesn't reward ambition here. It rewards return. The action stays intentionally small, almost boring. That's why it survives. Around day 7, something changes at night. Ken falls asleep faster. Not deeply, not dramatically, just without the long stretch of staring at the ceiling. He wakes up less irritated. He doesn't label this as progress. He just notices mornings feel slightly lighter. Hana asks again if she can come along. Ken hesitates, then agrees. They walk slowly. She tells him about her day, about a drawing she didn't like, about a friend who moved seats in class. Ken listens without checking his phone. 5 minutes passes quickly when you're present. This becomes their routine once during the second week. Not every day, just sometimes. Ken doesn't announce it as a habit. He doesn't want to turn it into something fragile. It stays casual, like a shared moment rather than a project. At the follow-up appointment, Dr. Mori asks how things are going, and Ken almost shrugs it off. "I'm just walking," he says. "It doesn't feel like much." Dr. Mori nods. "Good," he replies. "If it felt like a lot, it would already be at risk." He explains gently how identity forms through repeated behavior. Not through motivation, not through goals, but through evidence the brain collects over time. He mentions behavioral research from Stanford that shows consistency shapes self-perception more than intensity. It's one sentence, supportive, then gone. "Right now," Dr. Mori says, "your brain is learning a new fact, that you are someone who returns." Ken absorbs this quietly. He doesn't feel proud. He feels calm. The confidence building here is soft, almost invisible. There's no celebration because there's no finish line yet. By day 14, Ken notices something else. He's less reactive in the evenings. Or when Hana spills something or asks a question at the wrong moment, his response is slower, gentler. This surprises him more than the physical changes. You may know this experience when a small physical habit begins to affect emotional space. The Japanese philosophy doesn't separate mind and body. Movement clears tension. Tension affects patience. Patience changes how others experience you. These connections don't need explanation to be felt. Ken doesn't talk about the walks at work. He doesn't post about them. When friends ask what he's been up to, he says, "Not much." That's true, and that truth feels protective. Still, doubt visits. It arrives quietly during moments of comparison. He sees others training harder, changing faster. The old urge to escalate returns. He wonders if he's wasting time by staying small. Dr. Mori anticipates this. Early confidence should feel boring, he tells Ken. Excitement asks for more. Stability asks for less. Ken lets that settle. At the end of the second week, Hana hugs him goodnight and says, "You're not as grumpy lately." She says it casually, not as praise. Ken feels something tighten in his chest. This is the first external signal that something is shifting. You may notice this stage in yourself. The place where progress doesn't shout, but it whispers. Where results show up in tone, not numbers. Where the habit hasn't changed your life, but it has changed your evenings. Ken doesn't feel transformed. He feels more himself. That's new. And just as this quiet confidence begins to form, something else starts to press in. Other people notice. Questions appear. Doubt finds new openings. Outside pressure is coming. And the system will soon be tested in ways 5-minute walks alone cannot prepare him for. By the end of the first month, nothing about Ken's life looks impressive from the outside. His weight hasn't changed much. His schedule is the same. His job is still demanding. If you were measuring progress with numbers, you might miss it entirely. But internally, something steadier has begun to form. Day 30 arrives without ceremony. Ken realizes he hasn't missed many walks, but he hasn't chased perfection either. When evenings get chaotic, he shortens the walk instead of canceling it. This feels important, though he can't explain why yet. The habit bends without breaking. At work, a colleague notices Ken leaving on time more often. "New routine?" he jokes. Ken shrugs. "Just trying to move a bit." The comment seems harmless, but it lingers. The movement, in most people's minds, means effort, sweat, visible change. 5 minutes doesn't fit the picture. Friends respond similarly. When Ken mentions walking after dinner, someone laughs and says, "That's it?" Another suggests he should join a gym if he's serious. The tone isn't cruel, just dismissive. You may know this moment when your quiet progress collides with someone else's expectations. At home, his spouse asks a harder question. "Do you really think this is enough?" It's asked with concern, not criticism. Still, Ken feels a familiar pressure rise. The urge to justify, to explain, to promise more. This is where many habits collapse. Not because they're too hard, but because they don't look like effort to others. Social pressure doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers doubt into places you were just beginning to trust. Ken feels it that night. He stands by the door, shoes in hand, and hesitates. The walk feels suddenly small again, pointless. He wonders if everyone else is right, if he's avoiding real change by staying comfortable. You might recognize this stage. When external voices begin shaping your internal story. When you start seeing your progress through someone else's eyes. At his next appointment, Ken mentions this to Dr. Mori. He doesn't frame it as a problem. He just describes the questions, the jokes, the doubt. Dr. Mori listens without interruption. Then he introduces another Japanese idea. Gambaru. Quiet perseverance, effort without display, doing what needs to be done without seeking recognition. In Japan, Dr. Mori says, progress is often private. It's not meant to be impressive. It's meant to be reliable. He explains that when change is loud, it invites opinions. When it's quiet, it has space to root. He reminds Ken that the system isn't designed to convince others. It's designed to protect consistency. Ken thinks about this on his walk that evening. He notices how different it feels to move without explaining, without defending. The habit belongs to him, not the audience around him. Day 30 passes like any other day. Dinner, walk, home. But Ken notices something subtle. The walk no longer feels like something he's trying. It feels like something he does. That shift doesn't come with pride. It comes with relief. Hana asks if they can walk together again. They do, slowly. She talks about a book she's reading. Ken listens, fully there. He realizes this time with her didn't require energy. It created it. Or the Japanese method isn't about adding effort. It's about removing resistance. Ken feels less friction now, not more. That matters. Still, doubt hasn't left. It waits, it watches. The system hasn't eliminated uncertainty. It has simply given Ken a way to act without needing certainty first. As the month closes, Ken reflects quietly. He hasn't changed who he is. He's changed what he returns to. That distinction feels important, even if he can't articulate it yet. You may be in this phase too, where progress feels fragile because it doesn't look impressive, where others don't understand why you're not pushing harder. The Japanese philosophy suggests something counterintuitive here. Stability comes before intensity. Belonging comes before transformation. Ken doesn't announce month 1. He doesn't mark it. He just places his shoes by the door again, ready for tomorrow. The system is still small, the pressure is still real, and life is about to apply a different kind of test. Because consistency isn't proven when things are easy. It's revealed when stress arrives, uninvited, and asks whether your system can hold without breaking. By the 3rd month, the walk is part of Ken's life in a way he no longer thinks about. It hasn't grown much. Sometimes it's 5 minutes, sometimes 10, sometimes just to the corner and back. The size still doesn't matter. What matters is that it exists, and because it exists quietly, Ken assumes it's stable. Then work changes, a restructuring begins, extra tasks appear without warning. Deadlines tighten. Ken stays later. He brings tension home with him. You may know this shift. When stress doesn't arrive all at once, but seeps into evenings, eroding space slowly. The first night he misses the walk, it feels reasonable. He's exhausted. Hana is already in bed. He tells himself he'll return tomorrow. This thought feels familiar and harmless. Tomorrow becomes the next day, then the next. A week passes without the walk. During that week, old patterns slip back in without resistance. Screens stretch later. Food choices soften. Sleep shortens. Ken notices the change, but he doesn't interrupt it. Part of him feels disappointed. Another part feels resigned. This is how it always goes. Hana notices too. She asks why they haven't walked lately. Her tone isn't accusing, it's curious. Ken says work has been busy. She nods, accepting the answer. Still, something tightens in his chest. This time, the slip is visible again. You may recognize this moment. The realization that you didn't fail loudly. You drifted. And drifting feels harder to confront than collapse. Ken feels the old voice return, the one that says, "See, it didn't last." The one that turns a stumble into a verdict. He considers giving up entirely. At least then he wouldn't be pretending. At his next appointment, Ken tells Dr. Mori everything. The missed walks, the return of old habits, the familiar disappointment. He waits for correction. It doesn't come. Instead, Dr. Mori says, "You didn't fail. You stumbled." The distinction lands gently. He introduces another Japanese philosophy, wabi-sabi, the acceptance of imperfection as part of the design. Not as an exception, not as a flaw to fix, as a feature of real systems. In nature, Dr. Mori says, nothing grows without interruption. Seasons change. Growth pauses. Return is what matters. He explains briefly how the brain learns through repetition and recovery. How returning to a habit after interruption strengthens identity more than uninterrupted perfection. The science is simple. Neural pathways reinforce not just when you act, but when you choose to act again after stopping. This moment, he says, is not the end of your system. It's the lesson your system was built to teach. Ken listens quietly. Something inside him loosens. The pressure to be consistent dissolves into permission to return. That evening, Ken doesn't try to make up for lost time. He doesn't double the walk. He doesn't apologize to anyone. He puts on his shoes and steps outside for 3 minutes. That's all. The walk feels heavier than before. His legs resist. His mind argues. He lets both exist. Or the Japanese method doesn't demand comfort. It allows discomfort without escalation. When he returns home, nothing feels fixed, but something feels intact. Over the next few days, the walk reappears gently. Not every night. Often enough. Ken stops thinking in streaks. He thinks in returns. This changes how the habit feels emotionally. Missing a day no longer carries weight. Returning carries meaning. Hana asks to walk with him again. They do, slowly. She talks about a problem with a friend. Ken listens. He realizes that presence returned with the walk. Not perfectly. Enough. You may notice this stage in yourself. The point where relapse no longer feels like proof of failure. It feels like information. The Japanese philosophy treats relapse as feedback, not punishment. Ken's stress at work remains, once life doesn't simplify to reward his effort. But his response changes. When evenings are heavy, he shortens the walk instead of skipping it. When he skips it, he returns without ceremony. This flexibility is new and powerful. By the end of month 3, Ken understands something he didn't before. The habit didn't save him from stress. It gave him a way back to himself when stress pulled him away. Wabi-sabi reframes the story. The cracks aren't weaknesses. They're places where return becomes visible, where effort becomes honest. Ken no longer asks if the system works. He asks a different question now. Can I return again tomorrow? And most days, the answer is yes. The path was never broken. It was waiting. And now that Ken understands this, the system begins to deepen. Not through expansion, but through quiet refinement, preparing him for a version of himself that doesn't depend on perfect conditions to continue. By the 6th month, Ken no longer thinks in terms of starting over. There is no reset button in his mind now. There is only today. Some days are lighter, some are heavy. The system adapts to both without protest. You may recognize this shift when change stops feeling fragile because it no longer needs constant protection. Ken's walks continue, but they are quieter than ever. He doesn't announce them. He doesn't measure them. Sometimes they happen after dinner, sometimes earlier. Sometimes they are only a few minutes long. What matters is that they return, without guilt attached. There is no apology tour after the relapse. Ken doesn't explain himself to friends or family. He simply continues. This absence of drama is important. It keeps the habit from becoming emotional again. Emotion made his old attempts burn hot and disappear. Calm lets this one stay. Dr. Mori introduces a small addition, not a replacement. A Japanese method connected to food, hara hachi bu, eating until 80% full, not as a rule, but as a pause. Ken is asked to stop mid-meal once, breathe and notice, nothing else. Ken tries it. At first it feels awkward. He realizes how quickly he eats, how often food is used to quiet the day rather than nourish it. The pause doesn't restrict him. It interrupts him. Some nights he continues eating. Some nights he stops earlier. The system doesn't care. Awareness is the point. Over time, these pauses combine with the walks. Ken feels less heavy at night. Sleep improves again. Slowly. Mornings feel less rushed. Even though his schedule hasn't changed, the body responds to consistency, not intensity. At work, stress still exists. Projects pile up, deadlines tighten. But Ken notices something new. When pressure rises, he doesn't immediately escape into distraction. Sometimes he walks. Sometimes he pauses with food. Sometimes he does nothing at all. Choice has returned. A brief study comes up during one appointment. Long-term research from Harvard showing that sustainable behavior change comes from simplicity and repeatability, not effort spikes. Dr. Mori mentions it once, then moves on. The point isn't proof, it's reassurance. Hana notices changes too. Ken keeps promises more often, small ones. 5 minutes, he says, and he means it. Trust rebuilds quietly, not through grand gestures but through reliability. Children notice this before adults do. Ken's spouse comments one evening that he seems calmer. The tone is curious, not celebratory. Ken nods. He doesn't feel calmer all the time. He feels steadier. That feels more accurate. The Japanese philosophy underneath all of this becomes clearer now. Change isn't something you achieve. It's something you practice returning to. The system doesn't demand progress every day. It asks for presence when you arrive. There are still nights when Ken skips the walk. There are meals he eats past fullness. The difference is how these moments end. They no longer spiral into abandonment. They pass. You may feel this stage as well, when habits stop feeling like projects and start feeling like parts of life. When you stop negotiating with yourself constantly. When effort becomes quieter. At month 6, and Ken doesn't feel transformed. He feels capable of returning, capable of adjusting, capable of staying in motion without forcing direction. He notices how much energy was once spent on self-criticism. That energy is now free, not to optimize, but to live, to listen, to be present in small spaces that once passed unnoticed. The system has done something unexpected. It has removed urgency. Without urgency, Ken can see himself clearly, not as someone failing at change, but as someone practicing it daily, imperfectly, consistently. As summer approaches, Ken realizes he hasn't thought about quitting in a long time. The idea simply doesn't appear. The habit no longer depends on motivation. It depends on identity. And identity, once shaped through return, doesn't announce itself. It settles. It waits. And it prepares you for the deeper shift that comes not when you are trying to change, but when you realize you already have. 1 year passes without Ken noticing the date. There is no marker on the calendar, no celebration, no before and after photo. If you were looking for evidence of change, you would have to watch him live, not listen to him talk. Ken still works the same job. His commute hasn't shortened. His life hasn't simplified. What has changed is how he occupies it. He moves through his days with less friction. He responds instead of reacts more often. He doesn't rush evenings away anymore. The walks are still there. Sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes longer, sometimes replaced by quiet movement inside the house. They are no longer an activity. They are a rhythm, like brushing teeth, like locking the door at night. Unremarkable, unreliable. Hana is older now. She doesn't comment on the walks anymore. She doesn't need to. She trusts him. When Ken says he'll be there, he is. When he says 5 minutes, it's 5 minutes. Trust is built from accuracy, not intensity. Ken notices this most in small moments. When Hana asks for help with homework and he doesn't feel irritated. When he listens without drifting. When his phone stays face down longer than before. These changes don't feel dramatic. They feel stable. Looking back, Ken can see the cracks clearly now. The missed weeks, the tired nights. the old patterns that resurfaced and faded again. Instead of seeing them as failures, he understands them differently. Dr. Mori introduces one more Japanese concept, quietly. Kintsugi, the art of repairing broken pottery with gold. The cracks are not hidden. They are integrated, or they become part of the structure. Your interruptions, Dr. Mori says, are not damage. They are where your system learned to hold. Ken thinks about the sports day from a year ago, the moment he stopped running, the confusion on Hana's face. That memory no longer stings. It informs. It reminds him where the change began. You may feel this stage too, when your past failures no longer define you, when they become reference points instead of verdicts. The Japanese philosophy doesn't erase the past, it incorporates it. Ken's body feels different now, not athletic, capable. His mind feels different too, not constantly motivated or disciplined, just steady. When stress arrives, it doesn't knock everything over, it bends the system, not breaks it. No one applauds this version of Ken. There are no compliments, no milestones. And this is the kind of change that goes unnoticed because it doesn't ask for attention. But it changes everything. Hana learns something without being taught. She learns that promises don't need enthusiasm to be kept. They need consistency. She learns that returning matters more than performing. Ken doesn't lecture her. He shows her. You may notice that this is when identity finally settles. Not when you reach a goal, but when you stop thinking about reaching one. When you live inside the system without questioning it daily. 1 year in, Ken no longer asks if he can change. He knows he can return. And that knowledge is quiet, unshakable, and deeply earned. The effort and the stumbles, the patience and the pauses, all of it has shaped something durable. Something no one applauds, but everyone around him feels. And that is how lasting change often looks. Unremarkable, reliable, whole. By the time Ken hears the word Fudōshin, he almost smiles. Not because it sounds profound, but because it describes something he already feels. Dr. Mori introduces it gently, as he always has. An ancient Japanese system. The immovable mind, not rigid, not forceful, simply steady. Fudōshin is not about ignoring stress. It's about not being carried away by it. Dr. Mori explains that it was practiced by ordinary people long before it was ever spoken about. Farmers, craftsmen, parents, people who needed to remain present through repetition, not intensity. Ken understands immediately. This is what his life feels like now. He still gets tired. He still has difficult days. Work still presses in. But his internal state doesn't swing as wildly anymore. When evenings are heavy, he doesn't collapse into them. He moves gently through them. When mornings are rushed, he doesn't panic. He adjusts. The calm didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated, 5 minutes at a time, one return after another. Fudōshin isn't something Ken achieved. It's something that formed while he wasn't looking. At home, this calm shows up in small ways. Ken listens more than he explains. He reacts less when things go wrong. Hana feels it. She leans into him without asking. She expects him to be there, not perfectly, but consistently. This is the legacy forming, not through speeches, through behavior repeated quietly. Hana is learning what steadiness looks like by watching it live. She's learning that strength doesn't announce itself, it remains. Ken reflects on the past year without judgment. The relapse didn't disqualify him. The simplicity didn't limit him. The system didn't demand change. It allowed it. That difference matters. You may recognize yourself here, or you may not yet. Fudōshin isn't reserved for those who succeed loudly. It belongs to those who keep returning without drama. to those who choose calm over force, to those who understand that identity is built through what remains after effort fades. Ken no longer asks how to stay motivated. He doesn't need to. Motivation was never the point. Stability was. The Japanese philosophy guided him there without pressure, without shame, without spectacle. Change is no longer an event in Ken's life. It's a way of being inside it. He walks, he pauses, he returns. The system holds. And when life pushes, as it always does, Ken doesn't push back harder. He stands steady. And that is Fudōshin, the calm that remains when everything else moves. This is not the end of Ken's story. It's the point where the story no longer needs narration, where the system continues without explanation, where ordinary days are enough. And in that quiet steadiness, something rare has formed. Not perfection, not discipline, inner strength that doesn't need to prove itself. If this story stayed with you, take one small step before you leave. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, not for motivation, but as a reminder to return. Then leave a comment with one small action you will take tomorrow. Something simple, something almost too easy. A walk to the door and back. A pause before eating. 5 quiet minutes without a screen. Do not make it impressive. Do not make it public beyond this space. Let it be small enough that you can keep it even on a tired day. This comment is not a promise to change your life. It is a signal to yourself that return matters more than perfection. You do not need to feel ready. You do not need confidence. You only need one action you are willing to repeat gently. Tomorrow does not require motivation. It requires a place to begin. Write the action. Close the app. And when tomorrow arrives, return to it without drama. That is how systems form. That is how identity changes. Quietly, consistently, and without force. Begin there.